In the alien mythos, you have all kinds of different xenomorphs that are out there. You have your drones, which are the ones you see 99.9% of the time. You've got your queen, you have your queen mothers, which can actually communicate across interstellar distances, and queen mothers control queens. And then you have an alpha. And an alpha is a pretty new introduction to the alien mythos, specifically during Philip Kennedy Johnson's run on Alien under Marvel Comics. This is called Bloodlines. And what this does is it initially picks up with this guy who's talking, where he says the dream always begins in the dark. You think you know what that means, but you don't. You can't. The dark I see is a truer shade than just the absence of light. You can't find it just by clapping your hands over your eyes. Dark like this gets into you, penetrates you, tightens around your skull, presses into your eye sockets until something pops, and even the memory of light, even the belief in light, drains away. And so the question's actually being asked by a second individual, which is, what do you find there, Gabriel, in the dark? And Gabriel responds and he says, I see them, an insatiable math of rising, gnashing death, hunting for any sprig of uncorrupted life, beetles on the corpse of creation. She is with them. Her eyes are blind, cloudy, and still, her breasts unburdened by breath or heartbeat. I am utterly beneath her notice. In all the universe, she's a queen among lepers, a goddess among maggots, and yet I know she has noticed me. She's looking for me. And even though she's the nearest thing to true evil that exists, that thing that will someday reduce all life to gore and ash, I know that some part of me wants to be found. And so this is kind of a cool little bit of shifting that Philip Kennedy Johnson's doing here, because again, in the old mythos of the Alien franchise, and by and large Alien 3, Alien Resurrection, it's kind of pick your poison, right? Some people choose to believe they're in continuity, others don't. But the Queen Mother was the dominant xenomorph life form that was out there. But now, Philip Kennedy Johnson's kind of toying with this idea that there's actually somebody above that, even almost getting rid of the idea of the Queen Mother entirely. Now, of course, this is basically on a place called the Epsilon Orbital Research and Development Station, which, as those of you guys know from just the nature of Weyland-Yutani, is pretty sketchy, right? The other cool thing that goes on here is this takes place about 20 years or so, I believe, after the events of Aliens. But basically, Gabriel's getting flashbacks to like things that had transpired in the past regarding him and these xenomorphs. And so what you end up doing is picking up with what is in effect his retirement party. We don't really have to go super in-depth into this. Honestly, it doesn't really do much to move the plot outside of saying that like he's retiring. And so what happens is when you switch back to Gabriel at home in what's called the United Americas, he picks up with his son. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here when it comes to the alien mythos, you do have an expansive kind of adjustment to the way the world works in terms of how we see it now, right? The way the world is now, you just have like 207 sovereign nations or something along those lines. In the xenomorph mythos, you don't really have that, right? You have like the three world empire, you have the United Americas. So it's not as though it's just the world that does its thing and then Weyland-Yutani is like the only company out there. There's a lot of competitors to Weyland-Yutani. And that's one of the things that's going on here. The way you end up doing is basically picking up with Danny, who is the son of Gabriel. Now, the conversation between the two of them isn't really overly important. I mean, it is, but it's pretty short just because of the fact that Danny doesn't really want to hear anything that Gabriel has to say. The reason being because Gabriel dedicated his life to the Epsilon station, so much so that he actually lost his family in the process. Now, there is a lot more to that than the idea that his family just abandoned him because he's a workaholic. It's a really, really cool element of the story, but I simply say all this to say, this is basically just illustrating the fact that the relationship between Gabriel and his son Danny is very, very strained. Not only that, Danny is actually here for a particular purpose, which is to essentially steal something from his dad. And so what he does is he asks to go to the bathroom, and before he stops, he ends up basically coming across what is his father's office. And he sees a lot of like these old war images that are there, right? Basically the Colonial Marines, one of the Bishop androids. No, this is not the same group from Aliens. The bigger point is that Danny comes out, doesn't really give his dad much attention, right? He's there for like 15 minutes and then says, well, I have to leave. The other thing that goes on here is you actually end up learning that Gabriel had another son named Lucas, and Lucas is dead. Now, he's not overly important to this, but one of the cool things that we're going to learn is that Lucas had actually perished on the Epsilon station, and the death of Lucas is one of the things that kind of set all this in motion. But more so than that, what you end up finding out is that Danny is working alongside another girl, and they're essentially kind of a rebel faction. But what you do here is you jump back to then, right? We're not really given an absolute point in time. We end up finding out it's about 20 years ago. But the point is, Gabriel has this sort of memory of when he was strung up by aliens. This guy was captured by the Xenomorphs. Now, I won't go into any spoilers here and tell you what happened to him. I'll simply just say the experience was very harrowing, but there is something incredibly important that I want to specify here. One of the things that we're told is that when Gabriel wakes up, that actually one of his other platoon mates are there with him. The guy's screaming, the guy's panicking, as you would expect if you wake up to just this show of horrors with these little aliens crawling all over people, attached to their faces, and things busting out of people's chests. It's a very horrifying experience to basically have to deal with in such a short amount of time. But this guy starts screaming on about how Jamie won that vacation raffle at work and that he had taken leave time, so he isn't supposed to be here. But then another guy named Reynolds had called in sick, essentially, and that this guy was sent here in his stead. And so he's not supposed to be here experiencing all these horrors. The name Reynolds is one that I want you to keep in the back of your head because it will become incredibly important as we get further into this story. But at this point is when we switch over to when everything starts popping off. Because what we do is we rejoin the Epsilon station, and in the midst of these two members who were there, right, two employees that are just kind of, observing the docking station and all that kind of stuff, that suddenly like something docks to the ship. Now that's not supposed to happen, right? And the way it's kind of explained here is that this is a maintenance deck. And so basically a maintenance drone seems to have docked, but the reality is because of how this thing attached itself to the ship, it's not a maintenance drone. So much so that like one of them goes to check. They're immediately met with a shotgun and their head gets blown to pieces. Now after that, the other guy, he gets blown apart and the cat who's there basically flees. That's when you end up realizing it's Danny alongside what is in effect a rebel faction that he's working with to try to expose the secrets of Weyland-Yutani. And that's one of the cool things about this kind of expansion to the Xenomorph mythos that's been happening in Marvel Comics recently. Weyland-Yutani is not just some immutable organization out there doing seemingly whatever it wants. I mean, it does, but it does have other people out there that just try to work against it, try to expose what it's doing and bringing it down. And so what ends up happening next is that Danny and his guys start making their way through the ship in order to basically take pictures, right? But to also download data. The kicker about this is that instead of finding what they expected, which was a server farm and all these private top secret files that Weyland-Yutani had could be downloaded onto what is most likely a thumb drive and then disseminated out there, when they come to this basically biology lab, it's essentially xenomorphs, at least as we would know them or as we would expect to see them when you're trying to recreate them. And that's really what Weyland-Yutani is doing, trying to create more xenomorphs. Now, for those of you guys who read the old Earth War comic from back in the day, when xenomorphs ended up breaking out on Earth and overtook the entire planet and everybody just fled for their lives, we did cover that. I'll have a playlist in the video so you can get caught up. This is not exactly that, right? So it's not really Earth War, but by a different form. But what they do end up coming across is something called the Alpha. Now, of course, as you can expect, the Alpha is probably the most dangerous xenomorph that's here and certainly the one that's the most fully formed. But what ends up going on is a couple of scientists arrive here on the scene. They kind of beg for their lives and they say, hey, like, we will work with you guys, just don't kill us. And so in a moment of what's basically distraction, one of them spits out a series of commands, which initiates a security protocol. Of course, they get gunned down for their troubles, but it shuts everything down. The problem with this is that in all the shooting and the chaos, tanks start busting open. Basically, face huggers start popping out all over the place and attacking these various guys. And so Danny seems to be one of them. So things go south like that. Following this, you switch over to this guy who's talking to his granddaughter, trying to assure her like there's nothing there, that everything's okay, the kind of shadows or sounds that she's hearing, that it's not what she thinks it is, right? There's no monsters out there, only for him to be taken by a xenomorph, and presumably she gets killed as well. Now that's one of the things that is really interesting about the way that Phillip Kennedy Johnson does this is he doesn't spare anything, right? It's not one of these like the xenomorphs attack anybody they see, except for kids. Like that's not really how that works, right? They go after everybody, men, women, children, it doesn't really matter here. And so switching back to Earth, you have Gabriel who's contacted by Ted, who was basically Gabe's boss when he was on the Epsilon station. And so Ted kind of fills him in on what's going on and saying that 32 hours ago that basically Epsilon station went dark and we're essentially going to go up there and we're going to obliterate the whole thing. But before we do, I'm giving you a chance to go up there and to basically find a xenomorph and find the, alpha essentially, and bring it back. Now, the other reason why Ted is offering this olive branch is because he presents evidence to Gabriel showing him his son was involved with all these revolutionaries who were there. And so he's kind of strong-arming him, right? Because he's just like, you can go up there and try to save your son. Your mission is to get the alpha and bring it back. If you're successful, the slate gets wiped clean. If it's not successful, because your son stole your pass card and because your son used your pass card, you're the one that made it possible for him to do this, you're gonna go to prison, right? So it's kind of forcing his hand. It's very, very shady, but it's what Weyland-Yutani does, and really any corporation does. And so of course, Gabe ends up taking the job, but he's not really given any real measure of assistance. Instead, all he's really given here are just a couple of guys who were really capable colonial marines. But as we know from like Aliens, right? Like they rolled in there with a whole platoon and they got obliterated, right? I mean, it was one of the best scenes in the history of any of the Xenomorph movies. And it was such a landmark scene, right? In terms of like how those kind of things get done. But of course, Gabe knows everything to expect here. He's very much playing the role of what's essentially like Ellen Ripley here. And so this leads to like Gabe and his guys docking with the ship. And again, because there's only 3 of them, when they get in there, one of the things you learn is they weren't really briefed on what was supposed to be going on here. I mean, technically they were, but like they didn't watch any of the brief videos because they assumed it was just kind of like a bug hunt, right? Something small. So what this does is it seems to put out the idea that after the events of Aliens, that the whole circumstance in LV-426 was made known to colonial marines. It wasn't something that was just kind of shut away and hidden away and nobody ever knew anything about that. Now, the important thing that goes on is as they get in there, they find just a series of firefights, or at least what seem to be firefights, right? These kind of homemade defense systems, different things like that. It was very much like a panic that was unfolding here. Signs of chaos, signs of struggle, makeshift barricades, different things along those lines. And all these memories and experiences that Gabriel had in the past all kind of start coming back to him. Now, finally, they end up making their way to the biology lab to find that every single one of the xenomorphs here had basically escaped and either died or is out there in Epsilon Station somewhere. Not only that, the Alpha is out. And that's really where Gabriel starts to get concerned, is because the Alpha's the one they really have to worry about, right? That's the one they really have to concern themselves with. But in the midst of all this, they basically hear a kind of disturbance from the lockers. And when they go to investigate, they essentially find this girl there who's saying that she was like a kind of intern, right? That her name's Dorsey, and that when the guns came firing, she just went and hid because she didn't really know what else to do. Now, a couple face huggers do pop up, not much doing here, right? They do what you would expect them to do, which is throw them into a corner, spray them down, kill those things, and that's basically it. But one of the guys who's inexperienced goes chasing after the face hugger while he's shooting it. And that's when a drone pops up and kills this guy on the spot, rips his chest open. And so this other guy who's here, his mind is blown by what he's seeing because he's never experienced anything like this, right? He's never seen it firsthand. And very few people have and lived to tell the tale. But it's all important to understand, like, this is new to most people. And seeing a colonial marine eradicated in the span of like seconds just totally blows this guy away. And so of course, what ends up happening is the guy who was attacked, he basically ends up firing on the xenomorph while it's going after like Gabe and the other soldier. Essentially, it allows them a kind of distraction to fire off their own shots, and the xenomorph essentially takes off, right? They don't actually kill it here. And so what you get following that is you get Dorsey alongside Gabe, who are all going to find Danny. That's really the main mission of Gabe. Of course, he is also trying to locate those xenomorphs as well, right? Achieve the mission on behalf of Weyland-Yutani, because it's the only way to clear the criminal history of himself as well as his son, so they all basically make it out in one piece, as opposed to arriving back with empty pockets. Now, this other soldier, Hamilton, ends up giving Dorsey a gun just because of the fact that it's like, hey, with everything going on here, we all need to be prepared. We all need to be aware of what's happening, and like, we all need to be armed, right? Because there's safety in numbers. But then you do a quick little flashback, right, to again, 20 years earlier, where you have Gabe going through telling his story and really kind of remembering all these little things, where they basically arrived at one of these stations. And when they get there, of course, it's a place for livestock, which is the perfect breeding ground for xenomorphs. They do find a couple of organisms that are out here. They're referred to as Corcoran Highland goats, that they're basically bred for off-world colonies by Weyland-Yutani, just an alien race that they discovered. But what we end up seeing is they have the marks of face huggers on their face, meaning they've been impregnated by the xenomorphs. They just haven't manifested yet. And so all these little flashbacks are kind of going into this idea that Gabe himself, alongside the other colonial marines that he was with 20 years ago essentially walked into an ambush, much in the same way that the colonial marines did on Hadley's Hope. And so again, as they're making their way through, a couple xenomorphs do come after them, but ultimately nothing really happens. But you do get this really sad moment here because you pick up with Mitch. He was the grandfather earlier in the story that was talking to the little girl and was dragged away by the xenomorphs. What goes on here is that while his cat's here and, doing whatever a cat does in this circumstance, that Mitch shows the same thing on his face that the livestock showed 20 years earlier. Signs of having been attacked by a face hugger. And so while you do have Gabe and Mitch that are reacquainting themselves with each other after having not seen each other for so long, that Mitch kind of fills Gabe in as best he can, which is to say, like, the, lockdown system initiated, there was firing, but honestly, I don't really know a whole lot about what was going on out there. You have to go find my granddaughter. I don't know where she is. That Gabe puts it together incredibly fast after seeing the marks on Mitch's face. That number one, Mitch is impregnated with a xenomorph, and number two, his granddaughter's dead. And so what ends up happening is that, realizing the fate that awaits Mitch, that Gabe just kind of puts his hands on his shoulder and he says, okay man, grab your coat, let's go find Trudy. And as soon as Mitch turns around, Gabe puts one in his dome. And nobody understands why it is that he's doing what he's doing, but of course we as the audience know, and Gabe knows, that there is a chest burster there, and it's only a matter of time before it emerges. The kicker is that you end up realizing that Dorsey is not actually who she claims to be. And in fact, Gabe figured that out quickly. He figured it out incredibly fast because he interviewed Dorsey when Dorsey was being brought on. And so because of the fact that this girl stole his name, the question that he has is, who are you actually? And he basically ends up figuring out that this is Iris Humphreys. She's the one that's leading the terrorist organization that had Danny and initially boarded the ship. And so while there is a little bit of a standoff here, the response of Iris is, I can help you find your son, right? But you need to spare me, and I'm the one giving the orders here. She also recognizes that, like, the chest burster is about to bust out of Mitch, which it successfully does. Gabe does go in to try to contain it using cryogenics. He's not really able to do it. It ultimately escapes by busting out through the mouth of Mitch and then essentially fleeing and taking off. It does go after Hamilton, bites off a couple of his fingers, but then like another xenomorph pops up and starts attacking everybody. The cool thing is they're saved by none other than Bishop, who has arrived here in order to help Gabe. So it is cool to see that there's now an android here. The thing to know is this is not the Bishop that was Gabe's therapist back on Earth. This is another guy that's been stationed here, right? Another Bishop that was stationed here. Because as you know from the Xenomorph mythos, those of you guys who are familiar with the games and whatnot, they ignore artificial humans because they can't procreate by infecting artificial humans. So they're the same as like a wall or like a table or something like that. There is no differentiation there. And so as these guys start making their way through the facility, that Bishop basically leads Gabe to where everybody who was alive was taken by the Xenomorphs. If Danny is not dead, he is there, or at least that's where they expect him to be. Now, of course, Gabe doesn't believe it. He's like, my son's incredibly capable. There's no way he's caught up here. But when they get there and they start like checking out all these different people, they come across Danny. The kicker here is that Danny has a Xenomorph facehugger attached to his face. So one, he's being impregnated, which actually is not the worst thing. It gives them time because as those of you guys know, when you're infected with a Xenomorph, it's not as though the facehugger falls off and then immediately the Xenomorph pops out. You've got a window of time, usually anywhere between 8 to 12, sometimes 24 hours, depending on the circumstances, before it breaks out of your chest and ultimately kills you. And so what this means is that if they can get him to cryogenic storage, they can freeze him and the Xenomorph inside of him. Or if they can get to a surgical bay, they can remove the Xenomorph from inside of him and keep him alive. The point is, not all is lost here, but Gabe initially thinks it is. In his mind, it's just like, I don't want to leave him here like this. And there's no way for us to get him back to Earth in one piece. So we're going to have to kill him here. He doesn't want his son to suffer. But ultimately you have like Iris who pops back up again, seemingly out of nowhere, puts a gun to Gabe's head and is like, not a chance. That guy's coming with us, right? Like he's the man I love. He's coming. We're going to find a way to save him. And Bishop actually agrees, right? He's like, we really should find a way to keep him alive, if for no other reason than the fact that like, we can save your son. Now, some of it's also the nature of Bishop's programming, which is that he cannot harm or by omission of action allow another human to be harmed. So he's kind of following within the confines of his programming. But while they're just sitting here like going back and forth and bickering and all that kind of stuff, Xenomorphs pop up again because they're in the middle of a nest. It's the worst place they could be to stand around arguing with each other, right? It's just not going to work. And so of course you have Bishop that lays down suppressing fire with a flamethrower, and for the most part they're able to make their escape and just hightail it out of that nest. It doesn't get them entirely out of the space station itself, but it does get them a distance away from all the Xenomorphs that are over there. One does follow them, one does attack Bishop, but of course because he's a synthetic, he just kind of stands back up again. But ultimately they make it to the docking bay, right, to the very same ship that Iris and Danny and them used to arrive here in the first place. The problem is that as soon as the door is opened, there's like a handful of Xenomorphs in there. They immediately kill Hamilton, right? So now it's just like Gabe, Bishop, and Iris, and Danny, who's unconscious and being infected. They end up shutting the door to that thing so the Xenomorphs can't get through, and Gabe comes up with a last-minute plan. What he says is that all the executive quarters, so like the higher-ranking officials here, they all have like medical pods, surgical bays, they have cryogenic storage or hypersleep as it's called, but basically their rooms are built-in escape pods. So they don't have to leave their room to escape if something were to go south. Their room will automatically like depart the station and just jettison back to Earth. And so he tells them, go there, right? Like, here's my band, it's got executive clearance, I'm gonna take the long way around, draw the Xenomorphs away from you, but when I get there, be prepared to open fire. The problem with this is that once you have Bishop and Iris that make their way to that executive room, essentially, and then you have Gabe who's running with his son, the Alpha appears. And the Alpha is enormous, right? It's absolutely gigantic the way that it looks. And so for the most part, Gabe just flees for his life, right? All the while he's thinking these thoughts about like apologizing to his son, about how he wished he'd said everything that he was supposed to say, that he wanted to apologize to him for not having been there the way that he was supposed to be, all that kind of stuff. But what you end up doing is also getting like this little bit of a backstory to Gabe himself, where it kind of fills in the gaps of everything that had happened. And what ends up going on as he's like blocking face huggers trying to attack him is he says at some point in that mission 20 years ago that he and his guys were ambushed by the Xenomorphs, and he was attacked by a face hugger and he was successfully impregnated. But what he does is he gives us insight into what you experience when you're impregnated by a Xenomorph. And he says, we both know that the face huggers don't just lay eggs. When they're attached, we become part of them. While I was unconscious, I could still see the aliens, and not just the ones that killed my team. I saw the ones that made them. God knows how far from here, and others that didn't exist yet. I saw how far their reach goes, how small we are compared to them. I saw a tidal wave of living nightmares exploding out of my chest, blanketing the universe. And I saw one that was not like the others. I don't know if it was real, but I know it meant something. Again, basically talking about that higher level Xenomorph that is beyond the Alpha that you have here, potentially replacing the notion of a queen mother. But what ended up happening is that after Gabe was infected, that he was ultimately rescued by like Weyland-Yutani. It was really a bishop that found him, right? The bishop android found him, rescued him, put him in hypersleep, and when he was brought back, that Weyland-Yutani basically put Gabe to sleep, they cut him open, and they removed the Xenomorph, and they stationed it in Epsilon Station, and it's been there ever since. And that was all the work that Gabe had been doing this entire time, these past 20 years, trying to figure out weaknesses, trying to figure out ways to develop biological organisms that could actually destroy the Xenomorphs, so that if anything happened, that humanity would have some kind of counter to the power of the Xenomorphs. Because from Gabe's perspective, the Xenomorphs are this unrelenting and unstoppable force. You just cannot reason with them. And so the only way to defeat them is to develop a countermeasure that is equal and far more aggressive than they are. Unfortunately, it cost his family with everything that he was working on because he couldn't tell them what it was that he was doing. And so again, kind of fighting for his life here, that what ends up happening is when Bishop and Iris finally get to this executive suite, that like the Alpha is chasing after all of them. And at the same time, you have Gabe who just like throws a whole bunch of grenades over there right when they shut the door. And of course, it's not enough to destroy the Alpha. It basically blows a hole in the ship itself and just, takes out a whole bunch of the drones, or at least sends them out into space. But it does give them a measure of safety. The immediate idea is, let's put this guy into hypersleep, but they can't because the hypersleep table is isn't functional. And so it's like, we don't really have any options here. It's only a matter of time before this thing breaks out of his chest. And so one of the things that happens is you have this statement that comes from Iris that seemingly comes out of nowhere, where Gabe says, I don't care about the alien. I'm not giving up another son for any of this. I gave everything to this place, my marriage, my kids, my entire life. Now, one of the things he's referencing here, and this is why I said it was important, is that because this facility was not designed to have kids stationed on it, even though it did, that you had places kids could get into that were highly dangerous. In the case of Lucas, while you don't see it, Lucas had basically just kind of been running around the ship. He fell into a place where he ultimately got stuck, suffocated, and died, right? So like that's how Gabe lost his first son. And that's what created the rift between him and the rest of his family. But ultimately, Gabe says their damn bioweapon can burn up in the atmosphere along with everything else I sacrificed here. I choose Danny, and we need to get this thing out of him. And so that's where Iris chimes in and says a newborn xenomorph removed this early will not survive outside of its host. And so that's where you have Gabe who turns around and is like, wait, how could you possibly know that? And then in that moment, Iris shoots Bishop and then goes after Gabe. And it's just like, holy cow, like she immediately turns on them. And then she just goes to Danny after the face hugger had fallen off of his face. And it's just kind of like, okay. She ends up contacting a third party and says like, we are on our way. This is not Weyland-Yutani that she's talking to. It's a whole different organization here. And she says like, the sample is in utero, right? I.e. it's in Danny and is gestating. We have about 8 hours, but assume less just to be safe. And so she shows that she has no concern or care for Danny when the question is asked like, is the host one of yours? And she says, what does it matter? Only the sample matters, and it's ours now. Only for like Bishop to emerge and essentially go after and attack Iris on the spot. Now here's the kicker to this, right? That Bishop goes and kind of picks Gabe up and wakes him up and is like, hey man, are you good? Like we need to like find a way to get out of here. And Gabe is just like, how in the world could you attack her, right? I mean, your programming does not allow you to attack a human. And that's where Bishop's like, because she's not a human, she's a synthetic. And so this is a really, really cool thing, because what ends up happening is that while you have Gabe and Bishop who are trying to figure out what it is they need to do next, that Iris chimes in and she says, I'm more than human. I'm not less than human. Physically indistinguishable, a free synthetic. I don't expect either of you to know what that means. But basically, she's a synthetic that broke free of her programming. And she says, Danny came up here to make a difference, and now he will. Thanks to him, my people will make Earth a post-organic utopia. I pity you so much, Bishop. I wish you could see what a sad little puppet you are, just dancing on their strings forever. You should have been like us. You should have been beautiful. The whole goal here, right, for Iris herself as a synthetic was to bring a xenomorph back to Earth, find a way to get them to procreate. If she couldn't have an outright face hugger, just have them cocoon a human in the traditional form, which you saw in the deleted scene from Alien by Ridley Scott, and then in turn, unleash all these xenomorphs on Earth, wipe out the whole of humanity. And then synthetics could just start finding ways to eradicate xenomorphs entirely. As long as they don't attack them directly, xenomorphs won't attack them. But the bigger point here is she's like, it's only a matter of time. Whether it's because we attacked you or because you somehow managed to destroy yourselves, the end of humanity is nigh. There's no way to stop this. And so what you end up doing is you switch over to a conversation between Ted, Gabe, and Bishop. Of course, again, Ted is Gabe's boss and the one who sent them on this mission in the first place, and the one who brokered the deal. And while this is really just kind of Ted lording everything over his head and saying, look, you need to learn how to play ball, that you are going to leave everything as it is, you are going to let your son be as he is, you are going to allow this thing to come back to Earth, and then in turn, we will capture it as we need to. You and Bishop will likely be destroyed in the process, but that's a price that we're willing to pay. And he says, or you can remove that thing from Danny's chest, but you'll kill it in the process. But if you do, we will shut down the entirety of your vessel. Make your choice. And so ultimately, Gabe chooses to save Danny by performing surgery and ultimately cutting the xenomorph out of him. The problem is that when Ted said exactly what he said he would do, that's exactly what he does. He shuts the ship down. The only alternative here is for Gabe to don a spacesuit, go out to the outside of the ship, and start removing the communication arrays that exist on it in order for Weyland-Yutani to be able to control it, which he starts to do. The problem with this is that even by the time he gets to the last one, the Alpha shows up. And what happens is a kind of fight breaks out between the two of them. But as it does, and as Gabe is kind of fighting for his life and finally manages to pull the last lever here, he has this internal monologue where he says, Iris was right. We do this to ourselves. The alien is not the monster. It just does what it does. Just an animal protecting its young, operating on instinct. I cannot hate it for that. But Danny is my son too, and I already gave up a son so this thing could live. I will not do it again. And so successfully taking down the array that allows this ship to basically regain its engines and all that kind of stuff, Gabe dies fighting this alpha to the point like they just fall down into the atmosphere of the Earth and burn up in that atmosphere. Ultimately, Bishop is able to surgically remove the Xenomorph from Danny and then kind of fills Danny in on everything that had gone on, right? Everything that had happened. That Gabe had essentially saved them, right? That it was a rescue mission by Gabe, that Iris was basically a synthetic, essentially everything that we learned here. The cool thing about this, and this is why this story is so fantastic, is because while Danny is talking to Bishop and says, I'm already starting to forget it, I just remember the smell, right? This horrible, ungodly stink and the deepest dark that I've ever seen. There was something in the dark, I think, something looking for me, something far, far away. We end up finding out that the cat has been infected this entire time. And with Bishop and Danny none the wiser, that Xenomorph is being brought back to Earth. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Let me know down in the comments if you want me to cover the other stories, and I will catch you all later. Peace.